Moving on to the sixth president of the United States, the first one who was not a founding father, being the son of a founding father, John Quincy Adams. Adams' presidency is difficult to put in the five criteria, but I do think I'm going to use the five criteria as the rubric. Five criteria, again, are growth, finances, international politics, war and security, and better or worse. The reason it's difficult to put Adams into those five rubrics is his position in history is really a major turning point and a change for America, where if you look at it, it's kind of heartbreaking because America could have gone in two directions. And much like his father, I think John Quincy Adams was a very good person who had an amazing career before and after his presidency, but presidency itself, not so much. And we'll get into the reasons why as we go through these criteria. But he got off to a rough start with his very first actions, even before he became president, and that was the election that brought him the presidency. It was a four-way election for all intents and purposes. The Democratic Republican Party was the dominant party. The Federalists were not really taken seriously. At this point, I think you could even argue they ceased to exist for all intents and purposes in national politics. And so it was a four-way race. And in the four-way race, it came down to Adams and Jackson at the end. And Jacksonians will tell you there was a corrupt bargain made with Henry Clay, where Clay threw Quincy Adams the presidency in exchange for the Secretary of State. Both will deny that. But whether that's actually what occurred or not, that was the appearance. And at that point, the idea that you would have a one-party unified, everyone's going to work together, kumbaya situation was dead. You now had absolute factionalism. You had party infighting. You had the divisions of American politics forever founded and set. And Adams had an amazing agenda coming in. I think if he had been able to come in and accomplish the things that he wanted to put in place in terms of building a national college, building a naval academy, lots of infrastructure projects, I think we would look back at John Quincy Adams as one of the great presidents. Because I do think with the hindsight of history, which is why we do these rankings and why I'm not planning on doing a ranking on anyone less than 20 years out, because imagine doing John Quincy Adams before the Civil War, before you realize how everything played out in terms of factionalism and the American division and the outcomes of Jacksonian democracy and manifest destiny and all of that. If you didn't understand the road we were going down, it would not be an accurate way to look at Quincy Adams' presidency. But looking back, not to say that Quincy Adams is to blame, but it is to say this was a fork in the road, and because of his actions, he was not, the things that he wanted to happen did not happen. And not only did they not happen, they became unpopular because of his unpopularity. So again, let's start with growth. Growth is not always going to be in terms of physical growth of the countries. I think in the earlier episodes, I may have put too much emphasis on that as far as the thought when I'm discussing it, but it was because we're discussing the huge expansion of the country. We're talking about the Louisiana Purchase and the Adams-Honest Treaty and the acquisition of entire states. Growth is also about whether or not the country is growing in population, growing in industrial power, just growing in many ways. You don't need physical land to grow. If the population of your country is growing or the strength of your country is growing, I would count that under growth. And so there are some things to his favor. I think the B&O Railroad and the C&O Canal being the two biggest, because both facilitated westward expansion in a way that wasn't possible before, particularly the B&O Railroad being the foundation for what would become the huge railroad system that was the backbone of American growth and expansion, and everything that came afterwards came from the B&O Railroad. So Quincy Adams deserves that credit because that did happen on his watch and was funded on his watch. So credit to him for that. That being said, there wasn't much other growth in terms of economics because of things like the Tariff of Abominations, in fact, specifically the Tariff of Abominations. So he needed to fund these projects. The choice of what he did to fund these projects alienated people in the South. Perhaps his logic was, they're not going to vote for me anyway, so I might as well put that on there and then I'll make the Northerners happy. But it didn't make the Northerners happy either. It was just a failure on all accounts. It created an even greater wedge, as if you needed a greater wedge between Northern voters and Southern voters, in terms of the South believing that Northerners were only going to focus on Northern industrial interests and never give a care about the South. So that gave even greater narrative to that. Again, as if you needed it because of the slavery controversy, which is grounded in. And all of this, I'm going to say, it's not like the Civil War probably wasn't likely given, the original sin of America is slavery. It was ingrained in the Three-Fifths Compromise. It's something that they were never able to resolve without bloodshed before. There's no reason to put this on Quincy Adams. Believe me, I will be putting plenty of blame on presidents later. Quincy Adams will not be the lowest rated president um, in this list. But it is a turning point where before this, there seemed to be a general ability for us to have discussions and negotiate things. And after this point, there were just hard, fast party divisions. His reelection campaign was one of the most brutal. In fact, it was, I mean, up to that point, it was clearly the most brutal. Some of the stuff that his campaign was putting out about Jackson and vice versa. Jackson called Adams Czar's pimp. Quincy Adams put out broadsides about Jackson murdering American soldiers, and the coffin letters. It was brutal, and I think American politics has never fully recovered from this. Maybe it happens regardless of who's president. Maybe it had nothing to do with Adams, and maybe it was just the time for that to happen, and he happened to be the person on the watch. But if you're the person on the watch when things go sideways, it also still falls on you. So moving on to finances, again, the tariff of abominations, I think you have to give him a negative on that. I'm glad what he invested in, but the way he funded it and how the funding mechanism worked, that's a knock against him. International politics, I would say, is more of a neutral. I think he had ambitious goals to expand trade, particularly with the British West Indies that failed. But at the same time, he was able to work well with other countries. In terms of war and security, we kind of kept to that Monroe doctrine where we're going to stay in our place and you're going to stay in yours. There were no serious escalations. You can argue because everyone was very tired from the Napoleonic Wars and no one really wanted any escalations, but you still can say it didn't happen. So I think that's something positive for him. In terms of war and security, he was much more toward the assimilation side of Native American relations versus the Jacksonian approach, which we'll talk about next time. So I'm not gonna double down on that because we'll have a long conversation about that, I'm sure, in the next installment when we're discussing Jackson. All of this under the understanding we're talking about a lesser evil argument. We're not advocating for either path. Native Americans were here first. They had a right to be here. They shouldn't be forced to assimilate. But in ways that are similar to immigrant groups, even though they're native, they were a minority forced to change by a majority in some ways or be removed. You can say what you want about assimilation, and it's a thing that is not necessarily a positive. Obviously, we would love everyone to get along, but of the choices we had available at the time between Jacksonian approach and Quincy Adams approach, I don't think there's a question which one would have been better for Native Americans generally. And there's also a lot of things where I don't think people fully. I think people should sit down and read the history of Native American groups and understand that there was a lot more assimilation going on at this point in history than people wanted to admit, because then they have to humanize Native Americans and make them just like anyone else and say, just like other immigrant groups were able to come to America and become part of the culture and make the culture part of them, because it is a two-way street. Every immigrant group adds to the melting pot rather than being what they were before they came, or the country being what they were after they came. And Native Americans, I remember reading about the Cherokees and John Ross wearing a suit and having a plantation, and the Cherokee having plantations with slaves. Again, I'm going to talk. The channel is called History is Awkward. We have awkward conversations. A lot of the Native Americans had become farmers and had become plantation owners, and were ready to work in that regard and to become, for better or worse, part of the American South and part of the American culture. And that simply wasn't allowed by the next administration. Quincy Adams was open to, if they wanted to join with America, they could, and making that the line. You can argue that was still too much and wrong, and forced assimilation is still bad. I'm not arguing against the perfect. I'm arguing against the available. And of the two paths that America was likely or possible to take at that time, Quincy Adams would have been the far less bloody and would have been far better for everyone involved, in my opinion. But that's not the path we took. I find Quincy Adams' presidency to be sad that way. It is a road less traveled. I could see his father also being a road less traveled with a Federalist approach versus what came from the Jeffersonians. But I also think the Jeffersonians basically did a lot of the things Federalists wanted to do, and Jefferson was a huge hypocrite. And a lot of the things that Jefferson did were accepted because Jefferson did them, because it wasn't seen as a federal overreach when Jefferson did it. It's kind of like the whole when Nixon went to China thing. If someone does the same thing from a different party or a different perspective, it's much more accepted. So his father is a little bit different. I do think John Quincy Adams was a different path we could have taken from Jacksonian approach, from what came later with Manifest Destiny. I wish the country had taken that approach. I don't know that it would have avoided civil war, but I do wonder if there was a path there where we were the country that we later became in terms of becoming a melting pot country, or at least we were the country that we were to white people. Let's put it that way. If we had been more accepting, not that in any way, shape, or form we were accepting. If you're on my channel, I hope you've watched the videos I've done on Irish immigration, on Italian immigration, and the horrible things that were done by the Know Nothings and the nativists. I'm not trying to say that we were ever nice to any immigrant group. But I am saying if we had treated Native Americans and African Americans eventually as people who could be part of our culture rather than irreparable outsiders who were functionally too different to ever be part of the American experiment, I think everything in life would have been a lot better. And I think that is the way. And I wish more people would understand that every time we've done that in history, it's turned out for the better. But I'm drifting. Let's stay back on John Quincy Adams. I'm going to have to put John Quincy Adams in last place, in sixth place. I'm going to put him behind his father. It was close. I actually went back and forth whether John Quincy Adams would be above or below John Adams. What kind of did it for me was the Tariff of Abominations. I don't think Adams left anything as bad as that, as cancerous as that. And although Adams destroyed the Federalist Party, in the same way that Quincy Adams destroyed the Democratic Republican Party, I think the way that Adams destroyed the Federalist Party had less negative long-term ramifications than his son. So that's John Quincy Adams, sixth place.